The mountain man's voice boomed across the crowded auction house, silencing the jeers and whispers that had filled the stuffy air. "I want the 60-year-old woman," Ralph Martin declared, his weathered hand raised high above the sea of younger bidders. The room erupted in cruel laughter, men slapping their knees and women covering their mouths in mock horror. But Ralph's steel-gray eyes never wavered from the auction block where Maria White stood, her chin lifted with quiet dignity despite the humiliation burning in her cheeks. She had heard every whispered insult, every cruel jest about her age, her circumstances, her worth. Yet something in this stranger's unwavering gaze spoke of recognition, not pity. Something that made her heart flutter with a hope she thought had died years ago. The story of how they reached this moment began 3 months earlier, when the harsh Colorado winter had stripped away everything Maria thought she knew about survival and human kindness. The mountain settlement of Pine Ridge had always been unforgiving, but the winter of 1873 tested even the strongest souls. Maria had arrived in town 6 months prior, her husband's death leaving her with nothing but a worn leather satchel and the clothes on her back. At 60, she was considered past her prime by the harsh standards of frontier life, too old for the backbreaking work that sustained most families, too weathered for the delicate domestic roles that younger women filled. She had taken refuge in the boarding house run by Gloria Garcia, a stern woman who measured worth in coin and saw little value in charity. "You can stay through winter if you work for your keep," Gloria had announced, her dark eyes calculating. "Kitchen work, cleaning, mending. But come spring, you'll need to find other arrangements." The words had stung, but Maria accepted them with the grace that had carried her through 40 years of marriage to a man who had loved her fiercely until consumption took him in the autumn of her 59th year. The work was grueling. Maria's hands, once soft from a life of modest comfort, grew rough and cracked from scrubbing floors and washing linens. Her back ached from bending over steaming wash tubs, and her feet swelled from standing for hours in the cramped kitchen. But she endured, finding small moments of peace in the early morning hours when she would sit by the frosted window, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and rose. In those quiet moments, she would remember her husband's voice, his gentle hands, the way he had looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. The other residents of the boarding house treated her with a mixture of indifference and subtle cruelty. The younger women whispered about her behind their hands, speculating about her past, her prospects, her inevitable fate. The men ignored her entirely, their eyes sliding past her as if she were merely another piece of furniture. Only Kenneth Hall, the aging shopkeeper who occupied the room next to hers, showed her any kindness. He would nod politely when they passed in the narrow hallway, and once, when she had been struggling with a heavy basket of wet laundry, he had quietly taken it from her hands and carried it to the line without a word. As winter deepened, Maria's situation grew more precarious. Gloria's patience wore thin with each passing week, her demands becoming more unreasonable, her criticism more cutting. "You're too slow," she would snap when Maria couldn't keep pace with the younger workers. "Too weak, too old." The words were like physical blows, each one chipping away at Maria's sense of worth, her belief in her own value as a human being. It was during one of the worst blizzards of the season that Maria first heard about Ralph Martin. Kenneth had been telling stories in the common room, his weathered face animated by the flickering firelight as he spoke of the legendary mountain man who lived alone in the high country, surviving off the land with skills that bordered on the mystical. "They say he's been up there for 20 years, Kenneth murmured, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Ever since his wife died in childbirth. Some folks think he's gone wild, living like an animal. Others say he's the finest tracker and hunter in all of Colorado Territory." Maria found herself drawn to these stories, imagining this solitary figure moving through the pristine wilderness, self-sufficient and free from the judgments and expectations of civilization. There was something appealing about the idea of such complete independence, such absolute removal from the petty cruelties of town life. She began to dream of the mountains, of vast expanses of snow-covered peaks, where a person's worth wasn't measured by their youth or beauty or ability to conform to society's narrow definitions of value. The dream sustained her through the darkest days of winter, when Gloria's treatment became increasingly harsh and the other residents grew more openly contemptuous. Maria's clothes became shabbier, Her meals smaller, her room colder as Gloria found excuses to reduce the coal ration. She was being systematically pushed toward the breaking point, and everyone knew it. The question wasn't whether she would be forced to leave, but when and how. The answer came with the spring thaw, when Gloria announced that the boarding house would be undergoing renovations and that several of the older residents would need to find new accommodations. The message was clear. Maria was no longer welcome. With nowhere to go and no money to secure other lodging, she faced the terrifying prospect of destitution in a town that had already made clear her lack of value. It was Kenneth who suggested the auction. "It's not uncommon," he explained gently, his kind eyes filled with sympathy. "When folks can't support themselves, sometimes they indenture their services. It's better than the poorhouse, and you'd have food and shelter." The words were meant to be comforting, but they struck Maria like a physical blow. At 60 years old, she was to be sold like livestock, her remaining years bartered away to whoever was willing to take on the burden of an aging woman. The days leading up to the auction passed in a blur of preparation and dread. Maria's few possessions were inventoried, her health assessed by the town doctor, her skills and abilities cataloged like merchandise. She was to be presented as a domestic worker, someone suitable for cooking, cleaning, and basic household management. The auctioneer, a portly man named Samuel Perez, looked her over with the calculating eye of a horse trader, noting her sturdy build, her steady hands, her clean appearance. "You'll do well enough," he assured her, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "There's always demand for experienced help, especially someone who knows how to manage a household. Don't worry yourself about the particulars. These things have a way of working out." But Maria could see the doubt in his eyes, could hear the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. At 60, she was considered past her prime for even the most basic domestic work. Younger women were preferred for their strength and energy, their ability to bear children and contribute to a family's future. An aging woman with no relatives and no resources was seen as little more than a burden, a charity case that few were willing to undertake. The night before the auction, Maria sat alone in her small room, surrounded by the meager possessions that represented a lifetime of memories. Her husband's pocket watch ticking steadily in the silence, a faded daguerreotype of their wedding day, when she had been young and radiant with hope. A small wooden cross he had carved for her during their first winter together, when they had been so poor they could barely afford firewood, but so rich in love that nothing else mattered. She thought about the life they had built together, the dreams they had shared, the quiet contentments of their long marriage. He had never made her feel old or worthless or burdensome. Even in his final days when illness had ravaged his body and stolen his strength, he had looked at her with the same wonder and appreciation he had shown on their wedding day. "You're beautiful," he would whisper, his voice barely audible above the sound of his labored breathing. "You'll always be beautiful to me." The morning of the auction dawned gray and cold, with a bitter wind that seemed to cut straight through Maria's thin shawl. She dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a dark blue wool that had seen better days but was still respectable. Her hair was pinned neatly beneath a simple bonnet, and she wore the small pearl earrings her husband had given her for their 10th anniversary. If she was to be sold, she would at least maintain her dignity. The auction house was packed with curious onlookers and potential bidders. Maria recognized many faces from town, people who had ignored her or treated her with condescension during her months at the boarding house. Now they stared at her with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination, as if she were an exhibit in a traveling show, rather than a human being facing the most humiliating moment of her life. Samuel Perez called for attention, his voice booming across the crowded room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have here a fine woman of mature years, experienced in all aspects of household management. Maria White, age 60, widowed, seeking placement with a respectable family in need of domestic assistance." The words were clinical, reducing her to a list of qualifications and deficiencies, stripping away everything that made her human. The bidding started slowly, with reluctant offers from a few local families who needed help, but were clearly settling for what they saw as second best. Maria stood on the platform, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying to maintain her composure as her future was decided by strangers who saw her as nothing more than a commodity. The offers were insultingly low, reflecting the general consensus that an aging woman had little value in a world that prized youth and strength above all else. $10, called out James Morgan, a prosperous merchant who needed help in his store. She looks sturdy enough for light work? 15, countered Lisa Wright, the banker's wife who was known for her demanding standards and sharp tongue. Though I suppose she'll do for basic cleaning. The bids continued to creep upward, but slowly, grudgingly, as if each bidder was calculating the minimum investment required to secure what they perceived as marginal help. Maria felt her cheeks burn with shame as she listened to the casual discussion of her worth, the offhand comments about her age and limitations. She had become a burden to be distributed, a problem to be solved with the smallest possible expenditure of resources. It was then that the doors at the back of the auction house burst open, admitting a gust of cold mountain air and a figure that seemed to emerge from the wilderness itself. Ralph Martin stood silhouetted in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space, his presence commanding immediate attention from every person in the room. He was exactly as Kenneth's stories had described, tall and powerfully built, with shoulders broadened by years of physical labor and a face weathered by decades of mountain living. His clothes were simple but well-made, practical garments designed for function rather than fashion. Leather boots worn smooth by countless miles of rough terrain, woolen trousers reinforced at the knees and seat, a heavy flannel shirt that had faded to the color of autumn leaves. Over it all, he wore a thick coat of mountain sheep wool, its surface scarred by thorns and weather, but still providing warmth against the harsh elements he called home. But it was his eyes that captured Maria's attention, steel gray orbs that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. They swept across the crowded room, taking in the faces of the townspeople with a mixture of indifference and mild contempt, before settling on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. For a moment, the noise of the auction faded away, and there was only that steady, searching gaze that seemed to look past her appearance, her age, her circumstances, to something deeper and more essential. Ralph moved through the crowd with surprising grace for such a large man, people stepping aside instinctively to make way for his passage. Conversations died as he passed, replaced by whispers and nervous glances. The mountain man's reputation preceded him, stories of his skill and independence mixed with darker tales of his isolation and rumored wildness. To the civilized people of Pine Ridge, he represented something both fascinating and frightening, a reminder of the untamed wilderness that surrounded their small settlement. He took a position near the front of the room, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his attention focused entirely on the proceedings. The auctioneer seemed flustered by his presence, stumbling over his words as he tried to continue the bidding process. The current offers had reached $22, a sum that reflected the bidder's reluctance more than any genuine assessment of Maria's value. "Do I hear 25? Samuel Perez called out, his voice cracking slightly as he avoided looking directly at Ralph. "This is a fine woman, experienced in all domestic arts, capable of managing a household with skill and efficiency." The silence stretched uncomfortably as the previous bidders reconsidered their interest. The presence of the mountain man had changed the atmosphere in the room, introducing an element of unpredictability that made everyone nervous. Maria could feel the tension building, could see the uncertainty in the faces around her, as people wondered what Ralph Martin was doing here, and what his intentions might be. It was Lisa Wright who finally broke the silence, her voice sharp with irritation. $25, though I question the wisdom of such an investment. Her words carried a clear implication that Maria was overpriced even at such a modest sum, a burden that only desperation or charity would motivate someone to accept. The insult hung in the air like a physical presence, and Maria felt something inside her crumble. She had endured months of subtle humiliation, of being treated as less than human, of having her worth measured solely by her ability to serve others. But this public degradation, this reduction of her entire existence to a reluctant $25 investment, was almost more than she could bear. Tears threatened to spill from her eyes, and she blinked rapidly, determined to maintain what little dignity remained to her. It was then that Ralph Martin stepped forward, his movement sudden and decisive. The crowd parted before him like water, their nervous murmurs dying away as he approached the auctioneer's platform. His boots rang against the wooden floor with each measured step, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent room like a drum beat announcing some momentous event. $50, he said, his voice carrying easily through the hushed space. The words were simple, matter-of-fact, but they struck the assembled crowd like a thunderbolt. Gasps and exclamations rippled through the room as people turned to stare at this unexpected development. The mountain man had just doubled the highest bid, treating Maria's value as if it were a foregone conclusion rather than a matter of debate. Samuel Perez blinked in surprise, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as he tried to process what had just happened. $50, he repeated, his voice climbing higher with excitement. I have $50 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 55? But the other bidders had fallen silent, their interest evaporating in the face of Ralph's confident offer. They had been bidding reluctantly, calculating the minimum investment required to secure adequate help. The mountain man's willingness to pay such a substantial sum suggested either madness or knowledge they didn't possess, and neither possibility encouraged competition. Lisa Wright's face had gone pale with shock and indignation. $50 for a woman her age? She sputtered, her voice rising with disbelief. That's more than most families pay for a young girl with years of service ahead of her. What could he possibly be thinking? The question seemed to animate the crowd, and conversations broke out across the room as people speculated about Ralph's motives. Some suggested he was simply showing off, using his rumored wealth to make a point about his independence from social conventions. Others whispered darker theories about his intentions, their imaginations running wild with scenarios that reflected more about their own prejudices than any real knowledge of the man's character. But Ralph seemed oblivious to the speculation swirling around him. His attention remained fixed on Maria, that steady gray gaze never wavering from her face. She found herself looking back, searching for some clue to his thoughts, some explanation for this unexpected turn of events. What she saw in his eyes was neither pity nor calculation, but something that looked remarkably like recognition, as if he saw in her something that everyone else had missed. $75, Ralph said suddenly, his voice cutting through the babble of conversation like a knife. The room fell silent again, the shock even more profound than before. He hadn't waited for the auctioneer to call for higher bids, hadn't given anyone else a chance to compete. He was simply stating his intention to have her, regardless of cost. Samuel Perez's eyes went wide with amazement and greed. $75 was more than he had expected to collect from the entire auction, let alone from a single lot. $75, he announced, his voice trembling with excitement. I have $75 from the mountain gentleman. Do I hear 80? The silence that followed was deafening. No one in the room had expected the bidding to reach such heights, and certainly not for a woman they had all written off as past her prime. The other potential bidders sat in the stunned silence, their carefully calculated offers rendered meaningless by Ralph's extravagant display of interest. It was then that the cruel laughter began. Someone in the back of the room, emboldened by the surreal nature of the situation, let out a snicker that quickly spread through the crowd. The laughter was harsh and mocking, directed not just at Ralph's apparent foolishness, but at the very idea that Maria could be worth such an investment. Look at him, someone called out, their voice thick with amusement. The wild man's lost his mind over an old woman. What's he planning to do with her up in those mountains? Use her for bear bait? The comment triggered fresh waves of laughter, each cruel joke building on the last as the crowd's nervousness transformed into open ridicule. Maria felt her face burn with shame as the insults washed over her, each word a reminder of how little value she held in the eyes of these people. She wanted to flee, to escape this public humiliation, but she was trapped on the platform, forced to endure the mockery of people who saw her as nothing more than a source of entertainment. But Ralph Martin seemed unmoved by the crowd's reaction. If anything, the laughter only seemed to strengthen his resolve. He straightened to his full height, his presence becoming even more imposing as he surveyed the room with cold contempt. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of finality that silenced the mockery as effectively as a physical blow. $100, he declared, the words ringing through the sudden quiet like a bell tolling. And I want the 60-year-old woman. The emphasis he placed on those last words transformed them from a simple statement of preference into something approaching a declaration of war. He wasn't just bidding on Maria's services. He was challenging every assumption the crowd had made about her worth, about his motives, about the very nature of value itself. The auction house erupted in chaos. Voices rose in disbelief and outrage as people struggled to comprehend what they had just witnessed. $100 was a fortune by the standards of Pine Ridge, enough to buy a small farm or establish a thriving business. The idea that anyone would pay such a sum for the services of an aging woman seemed to defy all logic and reason. "He's mad," Lisa Wright exclaimed, her voice shrill with indignation. "Completely mad. No woman is worth that much, especially not one her age. What could he possibly want with her?" The speculation grew wilder and more vicious as the crowd's shock gave way to a kind of feeding frenzy of gossip and innuendo. Some suggested that Ralph had been living alone in the mountains for so long that any female companionship seemed worth any price. Others whispered about strange mountain customs and unnatural desires, their imaginations running to dark places that said more about their own twisted thoughts than anything else. But through it all, Ralph remained calm and unmoved, his gray eyes fixed on Maria with that same steady intensity. He seemed to be waiting for something, some sign or acknowledgement that would complete whatever transaction he had in mind. Maria found herself unable to look away, drawn by something in his gaze that spoke of understanding and acceptance, rather than the pity or calculation she had grown accustomed to. Samuel Perez was practically vibrating with excitement as he called for final bids, though it was clear that no one else in the room was prepared to compete with Ralph's extravagant offer. $100, he repeated, his voice cracking with emotion. Going once, going twice. He paused dramatically, his gaze sweeping across the silent crowd. Sold to the mountain gentleman for $100. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through Maria's very soul. In that instant, her fate was sealed, her future bound to this mysterious stranger who had appeared like something from a fairy tale to rescue her from destitution. But was it truly a rescue? Or had she simply traded one form of servitude for another? The questions swirled through her mind as she tried to process what had just happened. Ralph moved toward the platform with that same measured grace, his boots ringing against the wooden floor as he approached. The crowd parted before him, their earlier mockery replaced by a mixture of fear and fascination. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had appeared from a distance, his presence filling the space around him with an almost tangible sense of power and self-assurance. He stopped directly in front of the platform, his eyes level with hers despite the difference in height created by her elevated position. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, and Maria felt something pass between them, some wordless communication that transcended the chaos surrounding them. "Ma'am," Ralph said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. The single word carried more respect and courtesy than she had heard in months of living in Pine Ridge. He extended his hand toward her, palm up, the gesture both an offer of assistance and a question that she was free to answer or refuse. Maria hesitated for just a moment, her mind racing through the implications of accepting his help. Once she took his hand, once she stepped down from that platform, there would be no going back. Her life would be irrevocably changed, bound to this stranger whose motives she couldn't begin to understand. But what choice did she really have? The alternative was destitution, perhaps even death in the unforgiving wilderness that surrounded Pine Ridge. She placed her hand in his, feeling the strength in his calloused fingers as they closed gently around hers. His skin was warm despite the cold mountain air, and his touch conveyed a sense of steadiness and reliability that she hadn't experienced since her husband's death. He helped her down from the platform with careful courtesy, his movements deliberate and respectful. The crowd watched in fascination as Ralph completed the transaction with Samuel Perez, counting out gold coins with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he had shown throughout the bidding process. $100 in gold was more money than most people in Pine Ridge saw in a year, yet he handled it as if it were a routine expense, barely worth his attention. "Where will you be taking her?" Samuel asked, his curiosity getting the better of his professional discretion. I mean, for the records, of course. We need to know where she'll be residing. Ralph's gray eyes fixed on the auctioneer with a look that could have frozen water. Up the mountain, he said simply, offering no further explanation. The words carried a finality that discouraged additional questions, though Maria could see the burning curiosity in Samuel's face as he completed the paperwork. As they prepared to leave, Maria became aware of the whispered conversations following their every move. The townspeople were still struggling to make sense of what they had witnessed, their theories growing more elaborate and outlandish with each passing minute. She heard fragments of speculation about Ralph's intentions, about her fate, about the strange relationship that was beginning between the aging woman and the mysterious mountain man. But as they walked toward the door, Maria found that the opinions of these people mattered less and less with each step. They had been willing to let her starve, to treat her as a burden and an inconvenience, to reduce her worth to the smallest possible sum. This stranger, this man they called wild and dangerous, had seen something in her that they had missed entirely. The mountain air hit them like a physical presence as they stepped outside the auction house, clean and sharp and utterly different from the stifling atmosphere they had left behind. Ralph's horse was waiting patiently at the hitching post, a magnificent bay gelding that seemed as self-sufficient and capable as its owner. The animal turned toward them as they approached, its dark eyes intelligent and alert. "Can you ride?" Ralph asked, his voice still pitched low and respectful. The question was practical rather than judgmental, a simple assessment of logistics rather than any reflection on her capabilities. "It's been many years," Maria admitted, feeling suddenly self-conscious about her limitations. "My husband and I had a small mare, but we sold her when times got difficult." Ralph nodded as if this was exactly the answer he had expected. Without another word, he swung himself into the saddle with the fluid grace of someone who had been riding since childhood. Then he extended his hand toward her again, that same patient gesture he had offered on the platform. "I'll help you up," he said. "We've got a ways to travel, and the weather's turning." Maria looked up at him, this stranger who had just paid a fortune for her services, and felt something she hadn't experienced in months. A sense of being valued, of being worth someone's time and effort and resources. She took his hand and allowed him to help her up behind him, settling herself as securely as possible on the horse's broad back. The ride up the mountain was unlike anything Maria had ever experienced. As they climbed higher and higher, leaving the settlement of Pine Ridge far below, the world seemed to transform around them. The air grew thinner and cleaner, carrying scents of pine and snow and something indefinably wild that spoke of vast spaces and untamed beauty. The trees grew taller and more majestic, their branches reaching toward a sky that seemed impossibly blue and clear. Ralph rode with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in this environment, guiding the horse along paths that were barely visible to Maria's untrained eye. He seemed to know every rock and tree, every twist and turn of the mountain trail, navigating the treacherous terrain with an instinctive skill that spoke of decades of experience. As they traveled, Maria found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of her situation. There was something profoundly peaceful about the rhythm of the horse's movement, the steady sound of hooves against stone and earth, the vast silence of the wilderness broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe, protected not just by Ralph's obvious competence, but by the very remoteness of their surroundings. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend in the trail, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was larger than Maria had expected, built from massive logs that spoke of both skill and permanence. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and the windows glowed with the warm light of oil lamps, creating an impression of comfort and welcome that seemed almost magical after the harsh realities of town life. Ralph helped her down from the horse with the same careful courtesy he had shown throughout their journey, his hands steady and respectful as he ensured her safe footing on the uneven ground. The cabin's interior was a revelation, clean and well organized with handmade furniture that showed both craftsmanship and care. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with books and simple but beautiful objects that spoke of a life lived with intention and appreciation for beauty. "This will be your room," Ralph said, indicating a small but comfortable space off the main living area. I've prepared it as best I could, but if there's anything you need, anything that would make you more comfortable, you need only ask. Maria looked around the room, taking in the simple bed with its clean quilts, the small table and chair positioned near the window, the washstand with its pitcher and basin. It was more luxury than she had known in months, but more than that, it was offered with a respect and consideration that brought tears to her eyes. I don't understand, she said finally, turning to face this man who had changed her life so completely in the span of a single afternoon. Why did you pay so much for me? What do you want from me that's worth $100? Ralph was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her face with that same intense attention he had shown in the auction house. When he finally spoke, his words were simple but carried a weight of meaning that took her breath away. I've been alone on this mountain for 20 years, he said. 20 years of silence, of talking to no one but myself and the wind. I've watched the seasons change, seen storms come and go, lived through winters that would break most men. But I've never stopped believing that everyone deserves to be valued, to be seen for who they really are, rather than what others think they should be. He paused, his gaze never leaving her face. When I saw you standing on that platform, listening to those people reduce your worth to pocket change, I saw something they missed entirely. I saw strength, dignity, grace under pressure. I saw a woman who had lived through loss and hardship without losing her essential humanity. That's worth far more than $100, Maria White. That's worth everything. The words hung in the air between them, transforming everything Maria thought she knew about her situation, her worth, her future. This wasn't about servitude or charity or any of the dark motives the townspeople had whispered about. This was about recognition, about one human being seeing and valuing another in a way that transcended society's narrow definitions of worth. As the mountain wind whispered through the pines outside and the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced since her husband's death, the profound peace that comes from being truly seen, truly valued, truly home.